Engineering Department at AUC. Dr. Magda was born in Canada and later came to Egypt to reside. And this is a new information for me. Dr. Magda received her BS, MS, and a PhD in architecture from Cairo University. Her doctoral dissertation studied architectural design for children with special needs and sensory dysfunctions with a focus on autism. Dr. Magda has published various papers and articles on the subject in the National Autistic Society's Communication magazine. Just write Dr. Magda Mostafa's name in the internet and you will find a lot about Dr. Magda. Dr. Magda received many awards and published many papers on the subject. And there are many things that the time will not be enough to introduce Dr. Magda, so I invite you all to search for Dr. Magda Mostafa's name on the internet, and you will be surprised when you hear about her, because I was surprised too, because she is very young to do all this. Thank you.
Thank you, Hela. Thank you, Hela. Thank you very much for this overly generous introduction, Ayani, and I'm so glad that Dean Dina is here tonight. Really a dear friend. We haven't been able to spend as much time together as we're used to, so I'm glad we have this opportunity to meet briefly tonight. As both Hela and Dean Dina mentioned in their introduction, my area of specialty is designing for children with special needs, specifically for children with autism. I won't be talking completely about that tonight, but I will be talking about a general belief that I have about the importance of architecture and its role in everyone's lives, not only the lives of children that are in need of a very specific built environment. Of course, during the questions and answers that I hope I'll leave enough time at the end to get your input. If anyone has questions about the autism work that I've done, I'd be happy to answer them or provide you with more information. But tonight's lecture was actually Dean Dina's idea. Her suggestion to me was to share with you something that I have shared with my students for the many years that I've been teaching architecture. One of them is sitting in the back, so he can tell you whether I did a good job or not, is a belief that I have that architecture can be very powerful. And I think it's a power that some architects take very responsibly, others do not. Because as they say, with great power comes great responsibility. And as designers, we have a responsibility to make sure that we're handling this power carefully. If you think about your daily life, even just today, I would challenge you to think of one thing that you have done on your way to us here that hasn't been decided or managed or influenced by someone, a designer, outside of you, who's made a decision for you on how you're going to conduct that part of your day. For example, you wake up in the morning, you reach for the switch to turn on the light. If it's too high, if it's too low, if it's too far, that's a decision that a designer has made for you. If your window is facing east, then the sun has risen and shone into your room and woken you up to prepare you mentally for the day, and that's a good thing. If your room is not facing east, you'll wake up in the dark, which doesn't prepare you mentally for the day. So the designer that decides to place your bedroom or place the window within your bedroom in a certain orientation is influencing how you behave at the beginning of that day. And as you walk to the bathroom to take a shower, or to the kitchen to make a cup of tea, how that is laid out and how you get there is decided by a designer, whether it's an easy route, whether it's a complicated route, whether you have to pass by your brother's bed and wake him up on your way, and that's a problem for him every morning. Those are all decisions that designers have made for you. And it's not only on the scale of the house, it's on the scale of your neighborhood, on your building, on your city, as you come through traffic. The designers that design our city's streets and the design, the urban environment around us are influencing how we move throughout our city every single day. So designers have tremendous power over our lives and how enjoyable or unenjoyable, how easy or difficult those lives are. And that's why I titled this lecture Designing Everyday Life, because that's the way I like to look at architecture, that we are designers of life. We are the designers of how people carry out their lives on a daily basis, whether it's a school, a university, a hospital, a police station, an airport, a metro station, a street, a bridge, whatever it is, a designer decides how you live your life through that experience. So I'll begin with that statement, the power of architecture and the importance of it. But I also want to talk about what good design is and how important good design is. And this was, again, the suggestion of Dean Dina to share with you what I think good design should be. I'm going to start with a very interesting quote coming from an interesting person, Winston Churchill, who was a politician, nothing to do with architecture, never studied architecture, but he, as a politician, understood the power of the built environment over his people. He understood that there's democratic architecture, he understood that there's oppressive architecture, that through this design you can control people's lives. And that's a whole different conversation we've been having for many years now. We can have maybe in another session, but I think this quote is very relevant to what we're talking about today, that we shape our buildings as designers, as architects, as engineers, but then the buildings shape us. They decide for us how we are going to live our lives. So that brings me to the question that I hope tonight we'll look at together of the answer to the question, what is good design? And I use the word design here because I don't want to necessarily limit our discussion only to architectural design. A lot of what we'll talk about here could apply to all sorts of design, urban design, industrial design, fashion design, interior design, product design. The question of design itself is very relevant to all of the elements that we're going to be talking about today. And as you can imagine, and because we have architects in our audience, I'm sure that many of you have your own opinion of what good design is. And you have your own opinion of examples of good design that you've seen in your life or experienced in your life, or viewed through catalogs, through books, through the internet, or through even buildings that you've visited yourself. So it was a big challenge for me after these many years of studying and designing and working with a lot of architects and in different capacities, attending a lot of meetings and conferences, and through my work, I've had a great opportunity to work with some of the best architects in the world. And I decided to make that selection of what, to me, is good design as sort of a journey through the architects that I have been exposed to and have worked closely with. Some of them I call my friends, some of them are colleagues, some of them I've just been exposed to their work through personal and professional means. But I decided to make the selection of examples of what are good design by a journey through the people that my life has intersected with in the architectural world. And I'm going to try and explain each example that I am going to show you in specifically how I view it as good design. So the first example, I wanted to start at home here in Egypt because I don't think it would be responsible of me to bring to you a set of good design that's a dream that's outside of our horizons. I think it's important to demonstrate that good design can happen very easily here at home with just a little bit more awareness. So this first example is good design is creating architecture that responds to the landscape. And I know for those of you who are architects and non-architects, the word landscape has a very specific definition. We usually think of natural landscape, we think of paintings, we think of trees and mountains and rivers and lakes and meadows and animals. But that is not the only definition of landscape, or at least that's not the definition of landscape that I think is relevant to this example. The definition of landscape that I'd like to present is a little bit more broad, is a little bit more widened. It involves our social cultural landscape, our political landscape, our environmental landscape, our economical landscape, historical, so on and so forth. So it's not just about, about the physical surroundings of a building, but it's also about all those other layers. And that's what I believe a landscape should be seen as. So good design is creating an architecture that responds to that landscape. And the example I've brought to you is something that's probably very familiar to many of us. Yes, this is the Alexandria Biblioteca, designed by Snohetta, whose founding partners are Craig Dykers and Kjetil Thorsen. I had the opportunity to work with both of these gentlemen on several occasions, the last of which was just a few weeks ago in Vienna. And I think of this as one of the more successful buildings in our country, and more of the successful buildings even in our continent. I was working with architects in South Africa, and there's a lot of appreciation and value given to this building and how it integrates with this very complex landscape that I was talking to you about, and how it symbolizes and represents the history of the library, the history of our country, its importance of our culture and our civilization with regards to the world's civilization as well, and the role that Alexandria Library played in that Western civilization. The next slide is a short video by Kjetil, an interview conducted by the Lucena Museum in Denmark. You can find all this material online if you want to see the entire video. And in it, he explains the thought process behind the library. And I think it's important for those of you who don't know, and this is information that I've got firsthand from them, that this library was their first winning project. It was the first time they won a competition. And sometimes we think of these star architects as celebrities who have never failed, but they were losing competitions until the Alexandria Library. And that library changed their career completely. From that point onwards, they will tell you that the Alexandria Library is what made their career. Their latest building that just opened in September, this last September, is the 9/11 Memorial in New York City. It's a very important building. So they've gone from a small office who was winning nothing to building possibly one of the most important museums in our contemporary history. So this is a very important milestone for them. So I'll leave you to listen to Kjetil explaining their approach.
We'll try it outside. We had actually gone for a competition in Canada first, but then the Alexandria Library competition came out during that process, and we decided to really try that. Of course, it's a historical, very important. It's a mythology almost related to what it was. I had been traveling in Egypt for a few months, a couple of years earlier, and had fallen a bit in love with the country, I must say. Also the vastness of the history, deep science-related history, which so strongly influenced the Renaissance, for instance. And the library not only being a library, but a research place for scientists, and discovering mathematics, and going deep into all the elements that describe later history. Pythagoras, calculating the circumference of the earth with one pole in Aswan and one pole in Alexandria. Wonderful, just by reading the shadow length. I mean, geometry is science, capturing of books and wisdom. So these type of things were stories and relationships and historical importance of the beginning of the Greek era, the understanding of our civilization, you could say, the Western civilization. Yes, so when the library in Alexandria came up, it was just the most exciting type of competition related to content. At the beginning, you just try to interpret the program that you have in front of you, and you try to look at the site and the conditions and weather conditions, and you have a lot of restrictions. So you try to evolve a concept that you think satisfies exactly these notions that might be the same in Norway as in Egypt. Like I said, more the general aspect of humanism, you could say. And the library in Alexandria was a stronghold for humanism in its time when it was operating, because science was such an enormous part of knowledge, the knowledge-based human evolution. And to that extent then, what you have to do is to find something that represents that notion today without copying the Greek library tradition, yes? and without going into and removing the myth from people's minds. One of the most dangerous things you can do is to give shape to a myth that is already established in millions of people's minds. Because when you give it a shape, you take away their own picture of what this might have been. So it had to be somehow distanced from the relationship between what people had in their heads, what the history was, and how we interpreted it again. So quite obviously, as you know, it became also this intersection in time, like a time lapse. And the geometry is actually a torus. It's a turning element like a car tire, but stopped and frozen at some point in time. And on one hand, it pushes the ground down. At the other, it lifts the ground up. And exactly where it cuts the ground, it's sort of tilting on this line, invisible line. So you could easily say, in a relationship of past, present, and future, that the presence is now, obviously. So it's where I am. Within the split of a second, is presence, is now. That is always related to the horizon and where you have your eyes, because your eyes are always where you are, and the horizon is always where your eyes are. So even if I sink slightly lower now, I have a different horizon than you have, geometrically speaking, right? So horizon is a very individual thing, but it's also a very general thing, because it has a general definition. So now is the horizon, where the sun goes up and the sun goes down behind. It's the simplest way of defining now. Defining yourself in time, in a specific place. So that was the tilting point, the ground. Where it's pushed down could be past or present. And where it's lifted could also be past or present. That's up to you how you define it. But at least you would discover layers of possible histories tilting around the present.
That was Ketil Thorsen, who introduced nicely into this next project of Snøhetta. And both Craig and Ketil will tell you that the Alexandria Library really was their gateway to all these big commissions that they were getting. The next project that they moved directly into after the Alexandria Library was the Oslo Opera House, that many of you are probably familiar with. And it was an extremely radical at the time approach to an opera house in Europe particularly, who had a very classical approach to what opera was and its role in society. And I think it's interesting what Ketil says in the interview about the role of the library with regards to the history, and he's considering the history as part of the landscape that he has to deal with, and the imagination of people of what the library was before as part of the landscape that he needed to respond to. And in this building, he takes him and both of them take this idea of the landscape further into a more physical manifestation. So the building literally becomes part of the landscape of the city. And this is a picture in the summertime of the same building in Oslo, and how this urban space literally embraces and wraps up and around an opera house, where historically opera houses were very separate from urban space. There would be a big plaza. The typical European model is a big plaza, and the opera house that was very elite and secluded from the general population. And they found this very interesting. They took it upon themselves as a challenge, and they were almost certain that they wouldn't win, because this idea of bringing opera to the streets, bringing opera to the younger generation, might have seemed counterintuitive, not a logical way to approach it, but they always have this sense of the role of the building to become part of the city's landscape. And a very funny video that Craig shared with me in our last trip in Vienna, I think really symbolizes their success in bringing opera to the streets and bringing the youth into opera. And I'll show you the video in the next slide. Very different movie. So I think this, and they agree, that this video was very interesting. This video was sent to them by this extreme sports group to show them how this young generation was dealing with this opera house that had historically been so removed from that culture. These are completely opera, and motorcycles and heavy metal music are completely different cultures. And the fact that a building can bring all of these landscapes together, to me and to them, I think is very interesting. But their work isn't only about opera houses and libraries. They also work on very small scales, which is something I really admire in them, that they don't think of themselves as too big of a firm to do very small buildings. This beautiful building that takes the tradition of Norwegian woodcraft to a whole new level. It introduces digital fabrication using CNC machines. Some of you, the architects, will understand what I mean by that, but that's digitizing and using computers to actually build as opposed to handmade products. And this is a reindeer viewing pavilion on a mountain. Ironically, it's the mountain of Snøhetta, which is the name of the firm. It's the name of a mountain in Norway. And this is the end of a trail that overlooks the mountain where you can view reindeer in their natural habitat. So it's a completely different landscape that they're dealing with in this case, a landscape with animals, a landscape with preservation and conservation, but it's a very interesting form that they chose to use to display this landscape and this public function. And then on the extreme opposite spectrum is a very urban, very city landscape. This is New York Times in New York City. It's now currently, if anyone visits New York, I was there a couple of weeks ago, there are parts of Times Square that are now shut down. They're rerouting the traffic on Broadway to go around Times Square, and Snøhetta's proposing, and the city of New York is now implementing, completely pedestrianizing that part of Broadway and Times Square with no vehicles. So literally the people of New York will now have ownership of Times Square completely, which is a very radical and very interesting premise, and the work that they've done, I haven't seen it, it's not completed yet, but I'm sure it will be a fantastic urban space in a very crowded and dense and dynamic city. And this final project that I'll share from Snøhetta's work, some of you who are keeping up to date with the latest that's happening in architecture, this is the 9/11 pavilion that opens up to the museum underground. This is the site of the World Trade Center in New York City, Ground Zero. The big black pool of water is where this is where the North Tower stood. And the fountain area, they didn't design that fountain, but their pavilion is in the back. And one of the things I love about Craig and Keitel's work is their use of light and material, and their building almost dissolves. It doesn't appear that there's anything there at certain times of the day where the sun strikes it, which is important because it's the only building, it's the only structure that's actually built on the site of Ground Zero, nothing else. Ground Zero has been emptied, and all the new buildings are happening on the periphery, so this is the only one, the building in the back, this one here, the pavilion. The fountain is part of the master plan, and this is the pavilion. It's the entrance to the underground museum where all the remnants and kind of the memorial to the Ground Zero Museum is. So it's a very small building. It's a very subtle, very humble building, but at the same time, it's very, very powerful in its materiality. And to them, it was probably the most difficult project to negotiate its landscape, because you can imagine what a difficult landscape and how many stakeholders. They even use a word that I like to use when it's related to design, which is negotiation. It wasn't about design, it was about negotiation. It was negotiating the different stakeholders and making sure that they came up with something that was respectful for everyone. Okay, so moving on to the next point that I think is relevant from the work of my friends. Good design is building beautifully with renewable and responsible resources. A lot of us more and more are talking about sustainable design, sustainable energy, sustainable urban spaces, sustainable everything. We've heard sustainable food, sustainable fashion, sustainable media. I mean, now everyone puts the word sustainable in front of their product to give it a little bit more credibility. But in architecture, there's a lot of room for this type of sustainability, and one of the most powerful ways is to use materials that are renewable or recycled or recyclable. 30% of the world's carbon footprint is a result of the built environment. So that's tremendous. If we can reduce how much we are actually producing as in carbon footprint by the way we build and the choices we make, we can have an incredible, possibly the most impact. We would have more impact than traffic and reducing oil in mobility and transit. So these kinds of choices are really very relevant. The work that I've chosen to symbolize this approach is the work of Shigeru Ban, a Japanese architect. He won the gold medal from the International Union of Architects in Tokyo when I was there. I'm a member of the International Union of Architects, and that's how I know him.